Imprisonment. For centuries, it has been the mode of punishment for societies around the world. But is the prison model failing? And is it in fact fueling a cycle of crime? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. Globally, prison numbers are soaring, as are rates of reoffending. The system, according to many, needs radical change. Some European and Scandinavian prisons have been successful with a more holistic approach. The focus not on punishment, but instead on rehabilitation. Could that be applied to the country with the world's biggest prison population, the United States?
It's a system described as close to breaking point. The US has the world's highest incarceration rate.
So many young people end up in our criminal justice system. It's not normal.
No business would be allowed to run as poorly as our prison systems have run in this country, ever. The cost and the outcomes are abysmal.
But is punishment the only way to deal with criminals? Or is the rehabilitation approach seen in some European jails the answer? And how should governments around the world deal with society's offenders? Prisons have expanded by 400% over the past 30 years in the US, with just over 2 million people locked away in some 1,800 prisons and 3,000 jails. One report found that 68% of state prisoners reoffended within 3 years after their release and 77% within 5. Prison officials say years of outsourcing to the private sector has led to worsening conditions for inmates. It's led many to believe the problem has grown too large to ignore. But some European countries have a different approach. The focus not on punishment, but on rehabilitation.
There are less criminals in prisons because Dutch judges have started to sentence people in different ways.
In Norway, reoffences are the lowest in the world at just 20%. In the Netherlands, changing ideas about punishing criminals has seen many of its prisons standing empty. There are now only 38 prisons still in operation. 27 have been closed in the past 3 years. In Germany, up to a third of all criminal cases are diverted away from prosecution altogether. It's led to European jails being called prison utopia. But are they too soft?
It is very hard to set aside those other questions about punishment. Is it harsh enough? Is it soft enough? But all the evidence suggests is if you want to reduce risk, you need to increase people's ability to think rationally. We tend to kind of look at our fiction almost to tell us, what the crime population looks like. So they're all murderers, rapists. The reality is very, very different. And I think what you'll see in Norway and Sweden is a far greater focus on what you do with those people that have committed those lower level offences. Is prison going to help, or is there another way of approaching this?
The numbers do show some success, but even if some European models are working with low level offenders, an open prison style could be seen as too accommodating for violent criminals. Prisons serve an important role protecting society from its most dangerous criminals. But in the long run, does it really act as a deterrent to would-be criminals, or is the prison system simply fueling a cycle of crime?
It is an age-old question, to punish or rehabilitate. But what should the focus of our prison systems actually be? In the UK, prisons are apparently a breaking point. But what can we learn from those other systems, some of which we've looked at around the world? At today's Roundtable, James Conway, former superintendent of Attica Prison in New York State, joining us from that state. He's a critic of the Scandinavian prison systems, where he believes prisoners are not held properly responsible for their crimes. With me at the round table, John Attard from the UK Prison Governors Association, who says the main purpose of prison is to offer victims retribution and to get violent people off the streets. To my left is Morwenna Banalik, senior researcher at the Prisoners Education Trust. She says we have a duty to rehabilitate prisoners. And Lorraine Jones, an anti-violence campaigner of more than 20 years, joins us. She believes in finding community-based solutions to crime. Welcome to you all. Lorraine, let me come to you first of all. Your son Dwayne had been in prison. He was 20 years old. He was going straight after having been released from prison, and he died in a knife attack about 3 years ago. But there's something he said to you, which you repeated when he was in prison, which I'd like to read out. It is a horrifying place. I'm never going to go back. Do you think prison made him not want to reoffend? The harshness, the horrifying nature of it made him not want to reoffend?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. What I would say is the reason why he didn't reoffend was the support network which he had, myself and those in the community. His experience in prison was an eye-opener for him. He said it was extremely horrifying, the length of time they were incarcerated, the amount of violence which he had never experienced on the street, being in an environment of a lot of young other people that were carrying a lot of pain, mental health issues and emotional issues. But it's right for me to say this for Dwayne, that he went through a patch where when I had my divorce, he literally it broke him. And he went to prison when he was just 15 years, David, 15 years old.
Youth offenders institute.
Youth offenders, and he was there for 2.5 years.
But you see, it was the horrifying nature of the prison that he said would make him not want to go back. Morwenna, what do you take from that?
Well, I think that there is, I mean, that's surely a part. It is horrifying. It really can be horrifying. But, I mean, you mentioned about support networks.
Yeah.
There are also things that we should be doing to allow individuals to be their own support networks, building up self-esteem, building up confidence and building up hope that you can come out and do things differently. Because a lot of people in prison don't want to be back there again.
No.
But we need to upskill people and we need to allow people to develop themselves and support people in developing themselves so that they don't have to in the future.
James Conway, listening to that from New York State. Well, what do you make of the fact that certainly so far around this round table, the feeling has been that it needs to be more about rehabilitation than simply locking somebody up and perhaps throwing away the key?
Well, I think it's important to realize that the first goal is the protection of the public. That's why we have prisons in the first place. I think Lorraine's point is well taken, that the individual being released from prison does need to have some kind of a support system. We can't take an individual, a young man from the inner city, and release him right back on the same streets that he was involved with when he committed the crime. We have to give him some tools. And I think we do our best, given the resources that we have, to give them the tools to make themselves a better person, but the rehabilitation has to start from within. I think it's not just the prison. We do have an obligation to protect the public from the violent felons.
But what do you make of the figures from, let's say, Norway? 4,000 prisoners out of a population of 5 million. That's 1/8 pro rata of the US prison population rate, and the rates of reoffending are so low. You say the Scandinavian system doesn't work? Why not?
I'm not saying it doesn't work. I don't think we have all of the data yet, but to give an individual in a prison in Norway a flat screen TV, PlayStation in a cell, a refrigerator, and the individual in the prison is living in better conditions than their military prison, for example, I don't think is right. You take the same inmate in New York State for the same offense. My inmate for murder is doing 25 to life. The inmate in Halden prison in Norway is doing 6.5 years. But to a person, I asked them if they think that's enough, and they all said yes. God forbid, if you had a family member that was murdered, would you think 6.5 years is a sufficient amount of time?
Let me bring that back to John Attard with me here. in the studio. He talks about cushy jails in Scandinavia. We've had a prison open in the last couple of months called Berwyn, where the prisoners are not called offenders, they're called men, their cells aren't called cells, they're called rooms, they have phones, they have access to laptops. Is that the right way to go, or is it offensive, as James Conway seems to suggest, to the victims of crime?
I think, first of all, you introduced the PGA, or Prison Governors Association, stance as being that prison's about protecting the public and retribution. I think there are two important elements of the prison system, and if you fail to acknowledge that that's part of our system, then you end up with losing support from society to do the bit that matters, which is rehabilitation. And prisons are about rehabilitation, and the fact that they've lost, those that go to prison have lost their liberty is the punishment in itself. The question you need to ask society from the very outset is, do you want to be a victim of crime? And there aren't many people that would put their hand up and say, yes, I want to be a victim of crime. But likewise, when people are victims of crime, they want the state to do something about that. And sometimes it is about taking them off the street. Sometimes it is about them losing their liberty. But ultimately, it should be about having fewer victims when people are released. You forgave the person who killed your son?
Yes.
When he went to prison?
Yeah.
So how does what James and John say about victims needing to be protected by having people in prison resonate with you?
Well, having a prison sentence is a punishment, and if you're going to break the law, you need to be punished. I forgave the killer because of my vast experience in working with broken children, broken adults. Now, nobody's born a killer. He was created into this by a lot of other contributions and experiences of his life, which he was vulnerable. When I saw him in the dock, I want him to get the worst sentence ever. I saw a vulnerable young man because I've got that experience. Now, his time in prison is a punishment, but what I want is for him to be rehabilitated in the prison, so when he comes out, he doesn't kill another body.
How do you do that when we've lost 8,000, 7,000, 8,000 prison officers in the last few years? In the UK, the prison system is at breaking point. How do you know, get that kind of system in place, which presumably needs more people, not less?
Well, this is, I think, one of the really big challenges that is facing our whole prison estate at the moment. We are having to do a lot more with less. But that doesn't mean that we should be forgetting that this is the purpose. We need to be trying to rehabilitate. And we can be doing that. We still can be working towards reform whilst we are working in these challenging circumstances. And in order to do that, we should be putting education really at the heart. A recent government report last year by Dame Sally Coates said that this is the way that we need to be moving forward, because not only is it for the individual and what they're going to be doing in their lives and making that person, stop them from being a victim of their society and creating victims, but also making them positive contributors. We've got so many people in prison that we need to be tapping into that resource.
I'll come back to you, John, to ask you whether you think education's the right thing in just a moment, but we'll try with James in New York State once again. In your time as a prison governor, did you ever feel the US system, with its massive prison population, its massive reoffending rate, was actually working?
It works for some. It doesn't work for others. We went through a very difficult overcrowding period in the mid-1990s where I had double cells. I had 106 inmates in a double cell type of, I had 106 double cells with 212 inmates living in a cell made for just one man. And that was caused by the influx of nonviolent drug offenders in the prison system. We fixed that problem. We've gone more to a treatment mode now for nonviolent drug offenders. That leaves the big prisons like mine loaded with the violent felony offenders, most of which come from the New York City area. But if you come into the prison system and you don't have a fourth grade education level, you're required to go to school. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes these guys don't want to go to school, and the teacher doesn't want them in class. But it's a requirement. If your education level is so low, you have to go to school. And we'll try and couple that with the vocational program so that you can look maybe possibly learn a trade. So
I'm just wondering, looking at everybody around this table, that yes, you may be required to go to school, you may be required to do vocational training, but somehow you've got to make the prisoners want to attend those classes, to want to learn new skills. How do you do that?
Well, it's a massive challenge. As you say, we've lost 7,000 prison officers in the last 5 odd years. And the priority for some of those prisoners in prisons isn't actually education, it's getting safely from A to B. And if a prisoner's worried about being mugged on the way to a classroom, their tendency to engage in education tends to be reduced. The question is that how big our prison population is, and are there better alternatives? And the difficulty with the British system, or UK system, I should say, England and Wales, is that we've had 5 Justice Secretaries in the last 7 years. And Ken Clarke, when he was a Justice Secretary, I think 2010, suggested that we might want to reduce our prison population, and he was sacked for saying that. And we know, yet we know that community sentences, certainly for those serving less than 12 months, are much more successful than imprisonment, and it's cheaper.
So don't send certain people to prison for certain crimes when, as Peter Clarke said this week, Chief Inspector of Prisons, in jails we're now seeing a staggering rise in violence in the course of the last 12 months. Just don't put them in that position.
Yes, but I mean, we just linked safety. You know, how do you get somebody interested in education when they're scared of their own safety? And actually, I'm doing some research at the moment. I'm finishing my PhD, and in that work, I'm looking at the role that education can have on the institutional culture, and we're being able to see that actually, if you do invest in some progressive education, so not just teaching people to read and to write, but to have aspirations and to maybe go up to university level and to consider themselves as a learner, can have an impact on the way that the prison runs.
But what about the fact that violent crime has gone up by 18% across England and Wales in the last year? Perhaps people are doing it because they see a certain impunity. They don't think they're going to get sent to prison, or if they go to prison, it's not going to be so bad.
No, I don't think it's to do with that. I mean, there's a lot of factors which we're being faced with in the society as communities. Poverty is one of them. A lot of cuts happening in our communities, like within Brixton. I know it happens across the country. No community centres for the young people. They're vulnerable with nothing to do. But I don't want us to forget the fact that a lot of the prisoners are locked up longer than expected, up to 23 hours of the day. They're frustrated. So in terms of education, which I totally agree with you, Ina, there's different types of education that we can give them. I remember speaking to one inmate, and he said that he attended a class which was called a sycamore tree class. And he said he attended that just to get out of his cell. Now, the good thing was that attending that class, going through that restorative justice program, it transformed his mindset. Now, an individual like that coming out into the community, we're not at risk, and the community is the majority at risk, because if we've got one individual that is insane, he has the capability of killing 50, 60 people. So it's important that we do have the rehabilitation classes within there, and it doesn't necessarily mean maths and English.
Okay, let's just bring James back in from New York State. In your experience of the US prison system, do you sense that your colleagues regard themselves as educators or simply as jailers?
We have a multifaceted system where I was thinking as Lorraine was talking, we recently reintroduced the college program back into our system. Depending upon the way the political winds are blowing, some of the conservatives will say, we're not going to waste money on college for these individuals. We're going to throw away, we're going to eliminate the college program. Well, now, when the liberals come back into position, or into power, colleges is back in. The recidivism rate for college-educated inmates is very low. So, but it's costly. So does the taxpayer want to spend tax dollars having a college program for inmates? We typically have a grant, and we have volunteer instructors, and it's become very popular and very successful. And the other thing about the college program is the inmates who are involved in the prison, although it's a small number, their behavior is excellent. They can't wait to get to that.
Let me throw this idea out, because we've gone through a number of different examples of where we think it's wrong, but we haven't really come to a conclusion about where we think we need to take it from here and whether the public would accept that. So who wants to kick that off?
Well, first of all, I don't think rehabilitation and punishment are mutually exclusive. And the moment you say it's one or the other, then I think we're already on a losing argument. 57% of prisoners that come into prison have got a reading age of 11 or younger. And if a person can't get a job because they can't read and write properly, then their willingness or options become limited. And how do they then live? How do they get a job? How do they find somewhere to live? And these criminogenic indicators, be it reading, writing, mental health issues, where they live, their peer pressure, all become factors that we have to take into account. Now, when you lock somebody up, not everybody's willing to change at that time. And some people are more willing than others to change. And we need to focus our resources on those that we think are ready to address their offending behaviour. And then we can spend money in the right place. Because sometimes, with the best will in the world, people aren't ready to be rehabilitated at that time. And it's something, you get a life-changing event, be it marriage, children, something happens in their life, and they say, Gov, I don't want to commit any more crimes, and we need to be ready to provide them with support when that happens.
How do you stop the public thinking that prisoners are being mollycoddled if they're being given all of these, in quote, opportunities?
Well, I think we first of all absolutely need to recognise that prisons are part of society. They're very much part of society. And one fantastic thing that we're seeing across the country over the last couple of years is a big increase in these types of prison-university partnerships that have just been spoken about in America. But we're seeing them here. So universities taking their students into prisons and then running a class where prisoners and students are learning together at a higher level. That can be absolutely transformative, not just for the prisoners, but also for the students.
But you have to have, don't you? You have to have this balance where people don't think prison's a cushy number, and at the same time it's not so harsh that it destroys people.
Well, to be honest, it's not a cushy number. I mean, we've recently had investigations into Wandsworth Prison, and what we saw there was not cushy. We saw drugs being brought into the prison through the drone. We saw prisoners that were scribbling on their walls, crying out for help, saying that they feel suicidal and not getting that support. We saw inmates that are suffering from huge mental health breakdown. So it's not cushy.
I'm sorry if I didn't make myself clear. I'm talking about the perception of it being cushy, that if we go towards the educational softly system, people might think, hang on, these people aren't properly being punished.
And that's another route for education there. We need to be working as much as possible to try and get those messages out about what is important and what the experience really can be for people in prison.
And we need to get more resources for the prisoners, because there's a lot of them that do want that rehabilitation, and there are a lot of community groups that want to go into the prison system and deliver that voluntarily, and the doors are shut. So, you know, there needs to be more of a opening to get that resource to them. Yes, there has been major cuts, and yes, there are less prison officers, but there are a lot of voluntary groups that are voluntary want to go in and help.
What do you find, John? Are the doors not only literally shut, but are they shut metaphorically as well?
Well, the fewer staff you've got, the much more difficult it is to run a prison regime.
Because you have to do the basics first.
You have to do the basics first. For example, searching, security, processing of intelligence, etc. But if you really want to see change, it requires a political drive to change. And as I say, Ken Clarke, 7 years ago, when suggested the prison population should be reduced, was sacked for saying that because it was a conservative
Can
government.
I just get a quick roundup from the three of you? Do you think we've come a long way in the last 50, 60 years in this country?
Come a long way, yeah.
Rightly or wrongly?
Wrongly. Because the evidence is there. I mean, as a country, we're experiencing such high rates of violence, terrorism, poverty. The level of poverty in the UK is alarming, and the UK is known to help other countries, but now look at what we're being faced with in our country, which hasn't happened. I mean, I'm 44, and what I've experienced in my 44 years now, it's terrifying.
Have we come a long way, Morwenna?
I think that we definitely have further to go. I think that one of the things that we have seen is a massive trend for increasing the numbers of people in prison, and that might not necessarily be the direction that we want to be going.
And John, your thought on that?
I've been in the service...
Because you've been in it a long time.
I've been in the prison service 30 years, and in that time the prison population has more than doubled. We were making good progress up until about 2010, and in the last 5 years this government has pretty much abandoned the prison service in England and Wales.
OK, and James, a quick thought from you. Everybody can learn, but where do we take it from there?
Well, we've come a long way, I think, in a positive vein, especially at my facility, where in 1971, 43 people were killed in the worst riot that we had in the prison. But now we've got inmates that are out of their cell a lot more. We have a lot more educational opportunities, a lot more religious freedoms, a lot more recreational opportunities. And but like it was already said, we do have a long way to go. I think the aftercare is one of the places where we have to focus.
Well, we appreciate your time, quite literally, because it's very early in the morning there. James Conway, thank you. Thank you for joining us from New York State. Thank you, the three of you, for joining us at Roundtable. We know that prisons have, over the years, existed for two main reasons: to offer retribution and to protect the public. But is there a prison system that ever does justice for the victim on the one hand and the criminal on the other? You decide. You've been watching Roundtable from me, David Foster, and the rest of the team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.